Covenant is a silk that joins Unitarian Universalist congregations, communities, and individuals together in a web of interconnection. Promising to journey together is the precious core of our creedless faith. We define worship as shaping things of worth. In so doing, we create community, providing opportunities for transformation. As Reverend Kowalski lights the chalice, Shannon is posting words to our affirmation in the chat, which we will recite in unison. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve human need. For these high purposes do we unite in worship. Now, if you'd like to, please unmute yourselves and offer a greeting of peace and welcome to those making up our congregation today.
When I was in seminary a long time ago, I learned lots of fancy words like eschatology and deontological. But one of the most useful phrases that I picked up was the hermeneutic of suspicion. The term hermeneutic just means a method of interpretation, and the phrase hermeneutic of suspicion refers to the way that critical scholars read the Bible, not taking every word at face value, trying to understand who wrote this text and what audience they were trying to persuade, and a little about the historical context that influenced them. In other words, looking for hidden agendas. So, for example, lots of the letters that are attributed to Paul in the New Testament probably weren't written by him, but by later authors, because they seem to be addressing organizational concerns in the early church that only arose sometime in the 2nd century. And so, for example, the historical Jesus didn't utter every word ascribed to him. There were other people who were putting words into his mouth for reasons of their own. A few years back, a group of scholars calling themselves the Jesus Seminar used a hermeneutic of suspicion to guess at which parts of the Gospels could be traced back to the original man from Galilee. And they thought that short, catchy phrases like turning the other cheek were more likely to be authentic than long, wordy discourses because they were more likely to survive the generations when these were just oral tradition before the words were finally written down. But not everything could be genuine. In Matthew 16, for example, Jesus calls Peter the rock on which I build my church. But there wasn't any church at that point, so this was probably the work of some later editor. And the criteria that they used to distinguish the real stuff from the counterfeit, this could be debated, and it was debated, but this was their approach. So what does this have to do with critical race theory? CRT, as it's known, has become a buzzword lately. It's become a flashpoint for controversy. Fox News has bashed it. Several states have passed laws banning it from public schools. And in response, many people have felt compelled to defend critical race theory, which probably until a year or two ago most of us had never heard of, and which in public discourse has become a caricature, a boogeyman whipped up by certain politicians to engage their base. And in all this cacophony, I became confused. I somehow lost the signal amidst the noise, and maybe you did too. So, what is critical race theory? Well, one way to think about it is that critical race theory simply means that American history and our founding documents should be studied with a hermeneutic of suspicion. It arose as a stance in legal studies and jurisprudence. Scholars like Derek Bell suggested that statutes and court rulings that appeared on their surface to be race neutral had to be read with skepticism, getting underneath the text, because their actual effect might be to perpetuate inequality. So, for example, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution appeared to abolish slavery. That's the way it's usually taught. That's what I learned. The language reads, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." But of course, slavery was replaced by a system of Jim Crow, an economic peonage and mass incarceration that left as many blacks in the penal system today as were in bondage when that amendment was ratified in 1865. A hermeneutic of suspicion requires us to examine any legal change affecting African Americans as tending to keep intense power relations in place. So, for example, Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 was intended to desegregate public schools. The Fair Housing Act in 1968 was supposed to result in integrated neighborhoods, and neither panned out. Decades later, here we are. Public schools are still pretty much color-coded. Big cities like Detroit are almost entirely black, while nearby wealthy suburbs like Grosse Pointe are almost all white, despite what the law says. The birth of standardized testing back in 1947, beginning with the Educational Testing Service. That was supposed to create a meritocracy of smart, talented youngsters. It was supposed to end college admissions reserved for the wealthy and the well-connected. How did that go? Well, I got some pretty good SAT scores, and I got into Harvard because I'm good at taking tests, despite being a Polak from Oklahoma. So I tend to think that standardized testing is a pretty good thing. But a black child's family income is still a better predictor than grades or test scores of whether that child's college-bound. Those on the bottom tend to stay there. Social and economic mobility in the U.S. is declining. Even a conservative publication like Forbes reports that children born into poverty are more likely than ever to be trapped there, while all we have to do is look around to see that the rich are getting richer. So the more things change, the more they stay the same. And in this sense, CRT is really nothing new. In his book, Moral Man, Immoral Society, from 1932, the Christian theologian Reinhold Niebuhr suggested that modern societies inevitably rest on a centralization of power and influence. Industrial capitalism is characterized by owners and workers, by the haves and the have-nots, and the powerful habitually use their leverage to maintain their own advantages, hiding this behind a defense that their privileges are entirely rational or democratically determined or perfectly legal or the result of an impartial marketplace. Now, Niebuhr was writing as the pastor of a congregation in Detroit at the height of the Great Depression, an epoch that was different then, but also similar to our own. Then there were soup lines. Now there are food banks. Then there were hobos. Now there are homeless. Then there was a rising worldwide tide of fascism. Now there's a worldwide rising tide of fascism. Niebuhr considered himself to be a realist. He doubted that these internal contradictions and power struggles in society could ever be resolved just by moral suasion or better education or more intelligent debate that would bring everyone around the table so we could better understand the issues and all find a consensus. He doubted that we could all just be friends. He thought that power would never yield without a fight. And in a similar fashion, CRT applies a hermeneutic of suspicion to claims that rationality or the principles of political and economic liberalism are enough to solve our problems. Sometimes maybe liberalism is part of the problem. And really, I haven't been able to come up with a better definition of critical race theory that works for me. It's like the historical critical method of studying the Bible, which used to be called the higher criticism. It's not a body of content like teaching about the Tulsa race massacre. Rather, it's a perspective that looks behind the stated intentions of lawmakers and others in a position to influence the public square, to see how their actions are either tending to dismantle or to sustain the myth that we're living in a completely free and colorblind society, which may be an aspiration or ideal, but as it applies to the real world, is just a myth. And CRT has some similarities to the religious doctrine of original sin, of which Niebuhr was an exponent. He thought that egoism and tribal loyalties infected all our social relations, so that a perfectly disinterested or impartial benevolence toward our fellow creatures was impossible. Think about it. Think about it. You know, it's very hard to follow the golden rule, treating others the way you want to be treated. At least it's hard for me. Maybe some of you manage it. I find it difficult. But if treating others is hard, then loving others as they love themselves, that's well nigh impossible. You know, that's almost unachievable for human beings. We're just not wired that way. Original sin, this is a phrase that can make us squirm, but think about it this way. Human beings, we come into this world, we're born with both a moral sense and with a moral blind spot. And our moral sense allows us to empathize with other people. We feel compassion. We can tell right from wrong. We can think about the collective good. And this is what Jews and Christians and maybe even Unitarians mean when we say that men and women are made in the image of God or have inherent worth and dignity. But alongside that moral sense, our moral blind spot prevents us from ever truly walking a mile in another person's shoes. So we judge ourselves by our best moments and our own good intentions, while we judge other people by their actual behavior and their misdeeds. We make excuses and allowances for ourselves. Other people, not so much, especially if they speak a different language or look funny. And this is human nature. It's what Niebuhr meant by original sin, and it's why that notion has some credibility for me. In his book, Moral Man, Immoral Society, Niebuhr suggested that as individuals, we function, we perceive ourselves as moral beings. We're good folks. We're kind to our pets. We serve on church committees. We work for philanthropies. We're not consciously or deliberately mean, far from it. But considered en masse, in the anonymous collective, we human beings behave in ways that shock the conscience. As members of an immoral society, we acquiesce to wars and indiscriminate slaughter. As members of an immoral economy, we spend and consume in ways that intend no harm but that often carry a terrible price for our fellow creatures and the environment. As law-abiding citizens, we pay our taxes, but that funds an apparatus that guards against any instability that might upset the prevailing pecking order. So we're not necessarily biased or prejudiced on an individual basis, proponents of critical race theory might say, but collectively, institutionally, we're guilty because racism is America's original sin. But if that's even partly true, then how do we atone? What does redemption even begin to look like? When the historical critical method of studying the Bible came to the fore in the late 19th century, this created a schism, a crisis in Christianity. It saw a split and ongoing conflict between modernism and fundamentalism. Fundamentalists turned their back on the emerging scholarship. They insisted that every word of the Bible was literally true. They took the myths and legends to be facts beyond dispute. Jesus really walked on the water. He was born of a virgin. He really went to heaven. The Gospels were eyewitness accounts. Why would they lie? And then there were the modernists. The modernists distinguished between what they called the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. They admitted that many purported events in the Bible never happened. Jesus probably didn't say, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life." Probably never said that. But nonetheless, we've all experienced in our lives at some point shame and guilt. And we know that the experience of being loved can bring a profound sense of healing and its self-acceptance into our lives. Probably most of us have been at some point in that tomb of despair, where we feel trapped, where we cannot think our way out. But then we have been touched by grace, where despite ourselves the rock rolled away, and we experienced a rebirth. And these are realities of the mind and spirit. I think that now we're seeing a similar bifurcation. American fundamentalists want to insist on the immaculate conception of the United States untouched by any impure thought or motive. George Washington really did throw a silver dollar across the Potomac, never told a lie. John Wayne really did fight at the Alamo and died for our sins. The words of the pledge, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, these are taken to be descriptive rather than prescriptive, an actual accounting of the last 400 years. But this is not history, it's dogma, and it's a dangerous distortion, and the modernist has to answer. Almost a century ago, the minister of the Riverside Church in New York City, Harry Emerson Fosdick, delivered a memorable sermon titled, "Shall the Fundamentalists Win?" It's a question that's more pertinent than ever, and I think our response has to be to distinguish the America of history from the America of faith. The America of history is deeply flawed and has never delivered on its pledge of equal justice under law. But that should not stop us from embracing that promised land of faith where sisterhood is powerful and brotherhood is real, and every child is treated as a legitimate child entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, because all people are created equal. Black and white, brown, freckled, female, male and transgender, gay and straight. This is our creed. It's our faith. It's up to us to live it out, to create a more perfect union. Thank you for listening.